All right, so now let's discuss exactly what are human rights. What is the exact definition? Well, to put it simply, human rights are the basic rights and freedoms that belong to every person in the world from the time you are born until death. They apply regardless of where you're from, what you believe in, or how you choose to live your life. And they embody key values in our society, values like fairness, dignity, equality, and respect. And most importantly, they are a means of protection for all of us, especially more so for people who are more prone to abuse, neglect, and isolation. So essentially, human rights protects all of us, it protects all of you. But in order to understand human rights in its entirety, let's jump back in time to 1948 and take a look at the milestone document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is what you see on this slide. So the declaration, or otherwise known as UDHR, it basically illustrates the fundamental rights and freedoms for all. The declaration was actually adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. I want to go a little bit further and give this some context. The UDHR was actually motivated by the preceding world wars and the sheer devastation that was taking place during that time. So things got so bad that it was essentially the first time that countries agreed on a comprehensive statement of inalienable human rights for all. And governments of all 193 member countries of the UN have endorsed the UDHR. But now let's take a look at the most pertinent articles from the UDHR that involve workers' rights, because the well-being of workers is extremely crucial for businesses. Article 22 from the UDHR, it states that everyone as a member of society has the right to social security. What the article establishes is that a country should make assistance available to enable individuals and families who are unable to work. And they could be unable to work for many reasons, reasons like sickness, disability, maternity, employment, or simply just unemployment, retirement, and old age. Social Security, on the other hand, their benefits or a partial replacement income for qualified retired adults and other individuals with disabilities. But it's not only for these qualified individuals. Social Security could be for their children, for their spouses, for their survivors even. Of course, every single country has different social security schemes in place. Now let's take a look at Article 23, which focuses on the right to work. It states that everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Everyone, without any discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work. And I think it's very important that you remember this equal pay for equal work, because we will be talking about it when we look at ILO's principles and also when we look at gender equality as well. Next, we have Article 24. Article 24 emphasizes on the importance of leisure. It states that everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. Article 24 from the UDHR is actually very interesting because it presents the flip side of the right to work that I just spoke to you about in Article 23. So, Article 23 is your right to work, and Article 24 is your right to not be overworked. Sustainable development means development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, this is the very concept that led to the adoption of the SDGs. So the UNGPs are basically the global standard for preventing and also addressing the risk of adverse impacts on human rights linked to business activity. They provide the internationally accepted framework for enhancing standards and practices with regard to business and human rights. Just to let you know, this framework was actually proposed in 2008 by then UN Special Representative John Ruggie to the UN Human Rights Council. He basically did this to address the fundamental relationship between business activities and human rights. Let's start with the state duty to protect. International human rights law lays down obligations which states are bound to respect. Now, what does this mean? So, becoming parties to international treaties, states assume obligations and duties under international law to respect, to protect, and to fulfill human rights. And now let's take a look at access to remedy. For different companies, access to remedy is very much part of the due diligence process. It concerns providing the opportunity for victims of abuse to seek redress from a company that caused or, in certain aspects, contributed to that abuse. Remediation can be in many forms. It can be in the form of apologies, restitution, rehabilitation, financial and non-financial compensation, punitive sanctions, prevention of harm. Access to remedy is also about having processes in place, participating in or being part of the mechanisms through which your stakeholders can actually inform the companies about potential issues in their own operations or supply chains, and which allow potential victims to be heard and also to be taken seriously. When it comes to businesses, what does gender equality look like? This is very simple. We'll start with number one. Pay rates should not be determined based on a person's gender or race or age, religious affiliation, etc. And number two, everyone needs to be treated equally, regardless of gender, ethnicity, religion, etc. Leadership teams should essentially equally represent both men and women, and mentoring and career progression programs should be offered to everyone, irrespective of gender. Human rights due diligence, or HRDD, is a continuous process that helps companies to identify adverse impacts relating to human rights, labor rights, and also the environment, which are caused by or connected to company activities. Furthermore, it entails addressing these adverse impacts by ending the activities causing them. And in this sense, gender responsive due diligence, which is GRDD, is based on the recognition that human rights violations are not gender neutral and should not be treated as such. GRDD ensures that a gender lens is applied to each step of the due diligence process and encourages companies to actively support gender equality. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about human rights and the environment. So all human beings depend on the environment in which that we live in. A safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is integral to the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, including the right to life, health, food, water, and also sanitation. Without a healthy environment, we are unable to fulfill our aspirations. So these are some of the environmental issues affecting human rights. At the 49th session of the Human Rights Council, they presented the report on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. The report describes the ongoing toxification of people and the planet, which is creating sacrifice zones in which extremely contaminated areas where vulnerable and marginalized groups bear a disproportionate burden of the health, human rights, and environmental consequences of exposure to pollution and hazardous substances. Plastic pollution is not only a threat to our environment, it is also a threat to people, as every stage of the plastic life cycle impacts human rights. And these impacts include toxic pollution released in manufacturing, exposure to toxic additives in plastic consumer products, and waste mismanagement, disinformation campaigns about the risks of solutions to plastic pollution. There is a business responsibility to environment and human rights because businesses, human rights, and environment are connected by the environmental nature of some human rights, which have been progressively more recognized and protected in the last few years. And of course, human rights and environmental due diligence legislation is also extremely important because activities such as rampant deforestation, chemical and plastic production, fossil fuel exploitation, and other large-scale activities by businesses routinely jeopardize the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment.
Starting with the changing policy environment. The last 10 years have been remarkable because we have seen new laws appearing in many industrialized countries, and these laws have international effects. So they affect the subsidiaries, the contractors, the suppliers throughout the world because these are supply chains legislation. And if you look at this progression here, starting with the UN Guiding Principles, which is the landmark document from the United Nations when it comes to business and human rights, when it comes to due diligence. We have seen laws appearing in the beginning in the United States, and then we have seen them also expanding throughout Europe, in the UK, modern slavery, but then also other EU laws that culminated, as I will explain, with the proposed directive that is in the making now. So maybe a few words about this proposed due diligence legislation. We have a draft. It appeared in February this year. And now it is being discussed with the European Council, with the European Parliament. And in the next few weeks, we expect to have an agreement and a new draft. So what we can comment on right now is the general design here. As you see, it's not about human rights due diligence only, but sustainability due diligence, which means that both environmental and human rights due diligence is expected from the companies. So I think that the key point here is to understand, just by looking at the last 10 years, that there has been a dramatic shift. It's a shift from voluntarism, from corporate voluntarism, from soft law to hard law, meaning enforceable legal obligations. We'll also talk a bit about sustainable finance, because this is the second key development we need to account for. These are the developments in sustainable finance, in the real interest in the financial sector to actually invest in sustainability, both for ethical reasons, but for profitability reasons as well. This is the discussion about ESGs. These are the lenses used by the financial sector when they look at real economy and trying to see what companies are sustainable or not. Perhaps you have seen this special issue of The Economist from this summer, where this concept was analyzed. The practice in the last 10, 20 years has been analyzed based on empirical evidence, based on data. And the conclusion from this analysis has been devastating. It was very critical regarding the ESG concept as a whole, but also the peril of greenwashing, the fact that companies issue data and the investors build on that data, but it's basically a lot of unsubstantiated claims. It's a danger of greenwashing. In terms of practical tools to measure how companies deal with their due diligence obligations, for the time being voluntary, but increasingly legal obligations, perhaps a good place to start is to look at this corporate human rights benchmark, which ranks about 4 or 5 high-risk sectors and about 50 companies in each of these sectors based on their entire due diligence performance. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development also surveyed companies to see how they comply with these due diligence expectations. And the findings here have been that in terms of policies, in terms of codes of conduct, many companies by now, especially large companies, they have these policy statements that refer to human rights, to SDGs, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and so on. Where things go down in terms of percentages of companies is the implementation. So management systems, due diligence procedures, the coverage of the entire supply chains, not only obligations. That's when the percentage, as you see. This slide shows us some misunderstandings when it comes to materiality assessments. Some companies are still on the learning curve, and they have some assumptions that now are discredited, and some assumptions that leading companies do not use anymore. Now to the last part of my presentation, trying to wrap this up in a more conceptual way, we can discuss the international standard of due diligence. All these issues regarding risk management are now established in UN documents, in OECD documents, in World Bank documents. So many international organizations have clarified what is expected from companies. And because of the guiding principles, the emphasis now is on this concept of due diligence, human rights, or sustainability. So perhaps one issue that always needs clarification and emphasis is that due diligence is risk management. It's about risks, but it's important to understand that it's not only risk to business. It's not necessarily about risk to company profitability or reputation. It's about risks to people, to the right holders, to society. So this is what the company has to manage in the way that we discussed before. Of course, as the double materiality concept makes it very clear, there is an overlap. When you have the win-win situation, the better a company manages the risk to society, the more it benefits as well. But human rights due diligence is very clearly about risks to human rights holders. We have seen this slide when Savita discussed remediation, access to remedy here, but it's worth digging into it because this is how the OECD explains what due diligence is a process of identifying risks and impacts throughout the supply chain and then taking measures to prevent, to minimize, and to remedy harm when it happens. This PowerPoint will be shared, but I think that the OECD due diligence guidance from 2017, it's detailed, it's very useful, and takes us step by step through all these elements of due diligence. Perhaps it's worth emphasizing here about how to mitigate impacts that are very complex. They are somewhere in the supply chain, or they simply require massive investment in better equipment, so it's not so polluting, or it requires some complex transformation in the business model. You cannot cease the current activities as they are. How do you mitigate it? So there is a need for an action plan with clear responsibilities, timelines, in order to promptly, as rapid as possible, deal with that human rights impact. So correction action plans are a key element of the mitigation strategy for complex issues. Perhaps worth emphasizing that the guiding principles have been consulted with companies, and they have been carefully calibrated in terms of what is expected from companies regarding compensation and remediation. What we have seen is that human rights due diligence covers the entire supply chain, but that doesn't mean that the company is responsible for every single human rights abuse that happens in the supply chain. And therefore, the guiding principles emphasize that remediation is expected only when a company, let's say the parent company or the lead firm, has caused or contributed through its own actions to an abuse somewhere in the supply chain, whether it could be questionable purchasing practices or the way that subsidiaries are instructed to deal with environmental and social problems. If it's not a case of cause and contribution, but an abuse happens deep in the supply chain, the company is not expected to offer remediation and compensation. This is what the guiding principles put forward. So then it is up to the state or to that suppliers or subcontractor that has to provide remediation to victims, because the human rights principle is that a harm should never go unremediated. Somebody always has an obligation to offer remediation, but that doesn't have to be the parent company or the lead firm for every single abuse in the supply chain.
ILO is the global standard, or the global definition comes from ILO. And so according to them, the Forced Labor Convention of 1930, number 29, forced or compulsory labor is known as all work or service which is exacted from any person under the threat of a penalty, and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. So the ILO has 11 indicators on forced labor, and these are a set of 11 common clues, so to speak, of sorts, to recognize forced labor in supply chains. So as you can see, there's abuse of vulnerability, deception, restriction of movement, isolation, physical and sexual violence, intimidation, threats, withholding of wages, retention of identity documents, debt bondage, abusive working and living conditions, and excessive overtime. And also in line with the ILO's 11 indicators on forced labor, there are two kind of segments. One is the abuse of vulnerabilities and the endemic and contextual issues alongside it. So for example, there's threats and harassment, intimidation, or isolation. There's physical and sexual violence that we talked about previously. Then the retention of it's not just the passport, it's the valuable possessions of the worker, which includes the passports, but other personal documentation, whether it's the birth certificate, land deeds, or their educational certificates, and so on, are withheld. And then also financial penalty for leaving that they're struck with. So what it essentially means is that all these elements should not be there. And for there not to be forced labor, every worker should have freedom of movement. And when it comes to debt bondage, and debt bondage is often for victims of forced labor because they are tricked into working for little or no money to repay a debt. So that's kind of breaking down what the debt bondage is, and they are held hostage by that, more or less. And the recruitment fees and other related fees. So the other related fees would be travel fees. So when they first go for a job or like seek employment, the travel fees, whether it's the airfare, it's supposed to be covered. It's not something that the worker pays for. The health checks, visas, it's the same. It comes under as part of their contract. And the debt repayment and interest rates. And these are things that the workers are forced to pay, and their salary is held back till those are deducted. So this is a total violation of their rights. And in addition, the state imposed fees that the employer is supposed to be paying, those are also taken from the workers. So what is clear is that going forward, no worker should ever pay for a job. And internationally, there's a term for this. It's the employer pays principle, and there are a lot of the major multinational companies and so are all following that procedure. And forced labor is everyone's business, and that's something that everyone needs to remember. So with data from the ILO shows that nearly 28 million people are trapped in modern slavery globally. And the problem is getting worse, not better. And this means that organizations need to work harder to keep goods tainted by forced labor out of their supply chains. There is a huge amount of legislative demands that are coming, all over. And it's only increasing. And just to mention that the German Due Diligence Act actually kicks in January, in 2023. So things are moving really fast. So it's really important for companies to get their act together. And for Malaysia, there are more challenges because it was downgraded to tier 3 in the latest US TIP report. also downgraded in the ITUC Global Rights Index in 2021. So these things are also factors that do impact on the country and as well as the companies, because investors will be hesitant. Over the last few years, there has been a lot of focus on Malaysia, all for the wrong reasons, sadly. So there's been a lot of focus on human rights violations by Malaysian companies. And these are some of the headlines, articles in international publications, and so on. So the common allegations that Malaysia is facing when it comes to forced labor is that there are deceptive recruitment practices, high recruitment fees resulting in debt bondage, withholding of passport, personal documents. So all these things that the clips that we just saw as well, the workers talk about. And these are the ones that, really need to be addressed in order for the companies to do well, to mitigate risks and all that, and also to attract new investment, because it's very difficult otherwise. So factors that contribute to forced labor practice in Malaysia essentially is the lack of awareness about forced labor of workers and employers. There has to be real knowledge as to what it is. It can't be something that can be brushed away anymore. And also the lack of knowledge of laws and policies, fear of workers running away. So because of that, the employer fears losing money because of the recruitment costs, and then at the same time, that's why they hold the passport and other valuable documents of the worker. And also they're under the fallacy that this is the industrial norm when they see other companies also doing this. So the big picture, it doesn't come into the spotlight at that stage. So it is a deliberate act also by errant employers who want to capitalize on the vulnerability of the workers. And also that is why the inaccurate and misleading information is provided to workers, knowing full well that they have no access or any recourse to justice to get their rights restored. So this is how, for the outside world, these are the main issues. And for companies as well that are in Malaysia, these are the factors that really contribute for these practices being in the supply chains.
Stronger and stronger, that companies that are performing well when it comes to sustainability practices, okay, they will see a greater access to and reduced cost of capital. And this is a very important consideration, the fact that financial institutions and investors are somehow recognizing the good ESG performance, and they're linking the cost of capital, the cost of equity, access to investment to ESG performance. It's a very important driver to sustainability. So human rights and human rights practices affect a company's financial performance in this particular way, because obviously it's a part of ESG performance. Companies that have already begun to implement the UN guiding principles will be ahead of the regulatory curve. We saw before that there is this big trend and regulation is moving from soft to hard law. So know the most important human rights for your company. So international standards call on companies to prioritize human rights impact where the harm to people would be the most severe. So typically, these also bring the greatest risk to the business. So a company has to identify risks to people and assess the relative severity. So the priority for business, obviously, it's the implementation of the UN guiding principles, embed the UN guiding principles into practice, implement effective policies, training, due diligence measures, establishing the grievance mechanisms. We talked extensively about that, providing or cooperating in remediation. Let's talk a little bit about the green transition, okay? Because everybody's talking about the green transition, but I think it's important to, first of all, define what it is, and then look at some of the implications, and especially the fact that it has to be a fair transition, a just transition, and a transition that doesn't leave anybody behind. So let's start by looking at the definition. The green transition refers to the social change strategy that will allow us to turn the current environmentally unsustainable global situation into a new sustainable paradigm that drives development and peace, aiming to improve the living conditions of all. There are several, definitions. There are several visions and ways that can actually articulate a very similar concept. Okay, so the one that we use within the World Business Council and the BCSD is this vision called Vision 2050, which is this concept, this vision that has been created by the World Business Council. And basically, it's a vision of a world in which 9 billion, actually it's going to be 10 billion people roughly, will be able to live well and within the planetary boundaries by mid-century, by 2050. So this is what we are aiming towards. We're aiming, for example, within this Vision 2050, we have identified 9 pathways that require huge transformation, really transformation to a level, to a magnitude, and to a speed. Actually, it has to be implemented at a speed, at a pace that we've never seen before. And some of these areas include, for example, the energy sector that needs to be decarbonized, transportation and mobility, living spaces, products and material. We need to move from a linear economy to a circular economy, financial products and services, finance that need to be conducive to more sustainable practices, connectivity, health and well-being, water and sanitation, food. So in all these 9 sectors, one other consideration for companies that we talked about earlier on is the lead from the top. It's very important to have CEO leadership, and that CEO leadership plays a critical role in ensuring that human rights are taken seriously. One other important consideration when we talk about leading from the top is to mention the duty of care expected of directors, board directors. Okay, so board directors need to maintain sufficient knowledge and understanding of the company's business to enable them to carry out their duties. Directors should have access to information regarding risks and opportunities for the company. Priorities for business: improve transparency. As human rights awareness is increasing among stakeholders, businesses will be expected to disclose not only their position on human rights, but the issues they face, the responses, and the effectiveness of their responses. So full transparency and full disclosure. Companies should focus on building a culture of transparency and developing indicators and targets to guide and communicate their human rights performance. So engage transparently with stakeholders. So the public expects CEOs to be visible on issues of purpose and impact, and human rights are some of the most pressing. Companies need to demonstrate the values that they value their relationship with people and society by being personally aware, prepared and willing to take action. This issue of being personally aware is very important. Another important point for companies is to collaborate beyond their comfort zone. So many human rights are endemic and systemic, meaning that diverse capabilities, significant resources, and strong leverage are needed to address them. So it's important to engage other CEOs in your industry to build the leverage needed to change incentives in supply chain at scale, for example. Here is the framework of how business is expected to implement the respect and remedy pillars. Okay, so it starts with the policy. The policy should establish a commitment to respect human rights, and then embed human rights policy in the company's culture. Then there is the human rights due diligence, identify potential and actual human rights impact. We saw that. We need to act upon the findings, track the company's performance on preventing and mitigating impacts, communicate the company's effort, and then there's the remediation part, establish operational level grievance mechanisms, provide for or cooperate in remediation.